Hi, so this is Redux-Observable, can solve your state problems. How many of you guys have heard of Redux-Observable? Okay, that's quite a few of you. Okay, cool. My name is Kevin Ghadyani. I've got a few public presences here. Also, I have a year of experience with Redux-Observable. Hopefully, what I can teach you in this is, through my experience, what is a good solution for your state. Okay, so what do you guys want out of this talk? Anybody, just shout it out.
How that's going to make my life better.
How do you? Okay, good.
Do
so,
some amount of code, right?
Yeah. This is so you guys have a good familiarity with React and Redux. I know some of the people that have come to the talk don't, so just want to make sure. Okay, and then how many of you guys are using Redux Thunk? Okay, it's yeah, it's expected. And then anybody who's actually used RxJS? Okay, cool, just a couple. So I'll start it from the beginning. So we've got these. This is what. If you look at articles on async and JavaScript, this is what you're commonly going to see. You're going to see something about callbacks, and you're going to see that, oh, okay, you know, callbacks suck because you got callback hell and you can't follow where anything's going. And then you got promises, and they're supposed to be better, but there's always something wrong with them that people talk about. Now, there are things that I know that's wrong with them, is that they can only be fired once, and they're hard to cancel. And those are two things. And then when you're trying to catch an error, for instance, a promise that has to go through the entire chain just to get to the end of it. So even if you catch an error mid-promise, it has to return something that will then go through the chain again. So there's no real way to just like end a promise. And then generators, I don't know why they ever put this here, because it's a completely different model of async. It's a pull-based instead of a push-based. So it really doesn't even belong in this list, but people put it here as like the next step up from promises. And then you've got async await, which is supposed to be like even better than everything, but it's just an imperative approach to doing promises. It's the exact same thing under the hood. So I think that's incorrect. This is really how I see it. I see it where promises and async are the same, and then observables are just another method of doing callbacks, except for the difference is they're much closer to callbacks. You can call them multiple times, and there are a lot better ways of handling errors in there. So if you had to do error handling and callbacks yourself, it's much harder. Try catch is there, but you can't say, okay, if this errors, I still want to like put something back and go through the flow and keep going, and I don't want to just break my whole app because one thing didn't work like I expected it. So with observables, you have the capability of doing that. Now here's an example of a callback that's synchronous. So you might not know this, but callbacks aren't just asynchronous. You can do them synchronously. And this is kind of a dumb piece of code here. But what it does is this function will call a callback. That's all it does after some execution. There's no promises, there's nothing, there's no set timeout. And then if you look down here, all we're doing is we're calling that, we're passing in a callback function, and then it's going to do that thing synchronously. So what's important is this is what it looks like when you got async. I got a callback, a promise, and an RxJS observable up here. This is not necessarily Redux Observable, but it's RxJS. So very similar, a little bit different. So if you look here at this callback, what are you seeing? You're seeing, okay, I got to look down at the bottom to figure out what it's doing, but I got to go up at the top to figure out how it's going to do it. And that's a little confusing for a lot of people. Also, with the promise, like I said, it's going to just go through and execute. In fact, it executes as soon as this gets called, or created. So this is not a function. But as soon as it gets created, that promise is already executed. So if you're thinking by here you're going to wait 1 second and then display this, it's actually going to have started it here, and then when you do .then, you're just going to do a .then on the value of it. In this particular instance, the way to improve this would be to create a function here, and that way when you execute it here, it will start right as soon as you've called the function at this point. And the other thing with a promise, or not promise, RxJS observable, is it's so much easier. So you got this thing called the timer. It's just a set timeout under the hood and a bunch of extra code for observables. But if you look here, you call subscribe on it, it will just execute this. So whenever that timer is done, it'll fire an event. This will have a value that comes through, but in this case with the timer, it doesn't matter. There's no value there. The value is 0. And then you can it'll call a function at the end of it. So this one makes a lot more sense. In fact, you could just get rid of this whole thing at the top and just call it timer 1000. You don't have to name it like this. So, Redux. If you guys are familiar with Redux, this will be a good review. So, Redux is synchronous. It has views. If somebody clicks something in a view, it goes to an action gets dispatched, and then a reducer runs. That reducer updates state, and then when the state updates, your React components react to that state. This is similar to maybe even how you would do it in Angular, but a little bit different. But notice here we've got this asynchronous model. Redux does not handle the problem with async. So what you've got to do with async is you've got to put this middleware in there. And in Redux Observable, those are referred to as epics. So what they are, epics are functions that take an action observable and return you back another observable. What is Redux-Observable? It handles actions over time. So a very simple way to put it is you get an action in, you give an action out. And that's pretty much how it works. So if you look at the previous slide here, you get an action in, you got your middleware, it runs, and then it gives another action that eventually will run the reducer, put that in state, and then you're used. So for instance, if you had a component and it needs to make a data call, that component will call an action. It says like, hey, fetch this data. And then your middleware runs and actually does the AJAX call. And then when that data comes back, it calls another action and says, store this data into state. And then that hits your reducer. You got a reducer sitting there listening for like, oh, okay, hey, update the animal profile or something. And then boom, it goes into state, and all your components will react to that state change. So that's why that's important. Also, I think Redux-Observable personally is the best messaging platform for RxJS. So RxJS is just this library that does a bunch of stuff, but you've got to figure out a way to use it yourself. And one of the hardest parts is figuring out how to get it to get one piece to then message this other piece and then control this other piece. Now, if you're making your observables flat, like in each component separately, then you won't. You just have to deal with one thing. You create an observable and then you just subscribe to it at the end. But in a lot of cases, you need some way to pass messages around. You need some way to associate all this data together, all these different pieces of your application, so that if this thing fires, this thing will trigger, and then this thing happens, and then this thing happens, and then eventually you'll update state again. So that's why, in my opinion, Redux-Observable is actually better than RxJS. It's built on top of it, but it's better than just going flat RxJS because it's a messaging library for it. And also, it takes away the hardest part of Rx, which is managing subscriptions, hot and cold observables, and sharing outputs. So if you've ever used anything like this, you probably know how difficult this can be. If you haven't used it, just be glad you don't have to spend a bunch of time figuring it out, because it's already done for you. So why would you want Redux-Observable, right? Why would you even get into the point where you're going to use something like this? Redux actions, like I said before, are synchronous. They're not asynchronous. And so if you want to make them asynchronous, you have to pass them through some third-party middleware like this to handle that. And I think you can handle things like side effects, which are very common. You got console logging, you've got debugging. If you look here, local storage, cookies, tracking, all of the stuff that you would normally have to do in your application, which is really difficult. It's easier, you just fire off Redux actions and let it happen through your epics. You don't have to go manage state, you don't have to do anything like this, just send it off and let it do something. This is a little bit different than what I was saying before, because before I was saying an action comes in and action goes out. This is an effect where an action comes in, nothing comes out. So it's just like a dead end, essentially, like you would see in a neighborhood. So also, RxJS is declarative, it's not imperative. Sagas, if you've heard of that, that's an imperative way of doing it with generators, but it's like a completely different mindset to it versus using these functional operators and reactive programming. It can also send actions without user input. That's really important, because when your app starts, you might want to do a bunch of stuff. Like for instance, I've got a Chrome plugin I've been working on recently. It's not just for Chrome, it's in other browsers now, but the benefit is that when the plugin loads, it has to execute a bunch of stuff. There's no user interaction. There's nobody clicking something to tell it what to do. So how do I get that to fire off with Redux? Well, I can use Redux-Observable to do that. When the app starts, all these observables will start listening for things, and I could have an observable that immediately executes as soon as it's ready. It doesn't have to wait till somebody clicks something and an action occurs. So here's a simplistic example of what you might see. Now again, this is just RxJS, but I want to show you, it's not very scary. In fact, this might look better for you. So if you look at the vanilla.js one over here, you'll notice that it's got a set timeout, and then you've got this function that gets called after that timeout's over, and then the timeout's like this is down here. This is kind of hard to figure out, and when you got bigger apps and you got lots bigger functions, you got more stuff going on, this is going to be a lot harder to figure out. But if you got the RxJS example over here, you got a timer, it says boom, wait 1 second, then execute. And then this tap is tapping into the observable pipeline, and when you tap into the observable pipeline, you don't mutate it. So it's like a promise if you have a .them, but you return back the previous value that you got. And so I don't know if you're familiar with that, but debugging promises is difficult because anytime you inject yourself in the chain, if you don't return back the value you got, you're actually mutating the value of the next part of the promise. So with an observable like this, tap is great because you can just put it anywhere and you can just debug the value at the current time. Now I'm not showing it here, but there is a value that comes through here, and that's the value in your pipeline at that point in time. So you can say, okay, I want to figure out what happened after this map. So boom, you put this tap in there, you get the value out of that, you can log it out, you can figure out what's going on, you can put a debug statement in there. So why would you want to use this? This is, for instance, a reducer, right? You guys have seen these. This is a very simple reducer. It takes a payload property off an action and then just puts that in state. Why would you want something like that? Well, if Redux-Observable can handle a lot of your state management for you, your asynchronous state management, get something from an AJAX call, do some adapter on it so that it changes that data in a way that your application is going to be able to use it, and then just pop it in state. You don't have to do anything to it. You don't have to get all this complex code and manage it and switch it and change it. So you might see something like this in your application if you're using Redux-Observable because the reducer doesn't need to be as complex. Now, usually your reducer is a little bit more complex than this where you're having to do synchronization and say, okay, if an ID comes in, pop the ID in. But you don't have to do other code in there. So this definitely slims down your reducers as well. And so looking at Redux-Observable, it handles different kinds of, there's like a different kind of middleware that you can handle with Redux-Observable, and I put them out here just to draw them out for you, but in the grand scheme of things, you probably will never see something like this. So one thing that Redux-Observable can do, for instance, is side effects. So you got an input, no output. You got an input, and then it does something like a tap, like we showed before, where it console logs, and then it kills the observable pipeline at that point, after that. It says, I don't want to do anything else, we're done, no action. But if you look at this, there's a transformer, so you can take an action in, do something to it, like make it bigger and add more data to it or remove data from it. Like for instance, if you wanna say, okay, hey, there's like a bunch of stuff that just came in from this form, but I don't really care about half of it. I'm just gonna take a few fields off it and then do something with it, right? That you could do that with a transformer. And then you've got a mapper which takes one input and can be any output. You might have like 3 or 4 different actions that would fire after this comes in, but you can choose which one you want. Another is a splitter, so you take an action and you split it into multiple actions. Now you've probably come across stuff like this when you're using Redux, that you want to do other things with your actions. How do you take this action and say, oh, I want to get from cache and I want to get from the AJAX call, but I want to make sure that if the cache comes in first, that's great, but if the cache comes in second, I don't want it to then put that data into my flow, right? So a race condition, you can do that with Redux-Observable very easily because of RxJS's operators. So you've also got a way to filter. So if 2 inputs come in, you can filter it down to 1 input. You could do something like if somebody's clicking a mouse a bunch, you only want, say, 1 click every 10 milliseconds. So you can throttle it down so it only takes 1 click every 10 milliseconds. So you're not firing tons and tons of actions off when you don't need to be. And then you also got combiner, which you're going to see all of these often, and the combiner is another one where you take multiple inputs and you create a brand new output with it. Let's go for some examples. And so I just also want to preface this that some of these examples are from that plugin I've been working on lately, and so those have thankfully been allowed to me to use by a company named Insight. So I wanted to show you guys Redux-Observable in a nutshell. So I wrote my own Redux-Observable stateless, completely stateless. I actually ended up using this in that plugin because it doesn't have any state. But this is a stateless version of Redux-Observable here. The gist of it is literally just these few lines here. That's all it is. You gotta, and I don't want to go through it and describe it to you because it might be too much at this point, but it's not very big. I mean, this is the whole library that I've written out. And then over here, I'm using it. I'm basically loading in a bunch of epics, which are just functions that return observables. And then I'm running them through my create root epic, and then I'm going to subscribe to action. That's it. So very simple way of doing this. And then if you look here, this is what you would call an executable observable. So like I said before, callbacks can be synchronous. Observables can also be synchronous. So what's important here is that I can call this function, create executable observable, and then instead of a subscribe at the bottom, I've got an execute, and that execute will return a value after that observable is done. Now, obviously you can't do any asynchronous code in here, or else it won't work right, but you can do this and you can get a synchronous value out of it. So the observables have a little bit more power than you might imagine, and it's something which is really nice when you're using it. This is another example of like a logging service, right? So let's say your app's doing all this stuff, but also you want to listen to actions that happen. In fact, this could be a tracking service, right? So when this action comes in, update user info, that means the user account has changed. So maybe you want to go change that user information. Well, what you can do is you can say, okay, I've got this third-party thing, it's sitting there running, it's listening for events where the user information changes, and then I'm going to mutate the data in a way that it cares about, because it wants it formatted this way. And then I'm going to, at the bottom, tap, which sends it out to their function, which gets that information that we just made above and pushes it into their API. So that ignore elements at the bottom says kill the observable chain at that point. That's why that's important. So when you're often doing side effects, you'll see something like a tap and then an ignore elements, so that you end the chain at that point. You don't have to fire another action off. Because if
what happens if you don't?
It'll error. You have to fire off another action if it gets to the end of the chain. So if you do ignore elements, you can just stop it right there. So what's important here is like this is very simple, but this is something you probably do a lot. And so you want basically any action comes in, get some data, send it off to somebody else. I've used this a lot in the previous application I worked on, where we're trying to log data, and it's for instance like logging Redux actions, or it's logging like when the user clicks something. Then I needed to figure out how do I track that? How do I keep that information? Well, with Redux it's very easy, right? You've got this action, and then it does a bunch of stuff, and so you can do the same thing here. Okay, so. If you look at these are two examples of the same thing, but I did them a little bit differently. And I know this is really complicated, and there's a lot of stuff going on here, but as you learn RX and you learn Redux-Observable, this actually becomes really easy to read. And in fact, I think it becomes easier to read than normal code. Because normal code, you gotta look at it like, oh, there's a for loop here, what's that doing? I don't know, I gotta figure out. Let me look at this part of the code, let me look at this part of the code. How do I put all this together? With this, all of these named functions here on the left tell you exactly what everything is doing. Now, you do have to learn these, but it doesn't take very long. I could probably go through it within another half hour to show you like what all these do, and you can get a pretty good grip on it. So if you look here, this is doing state $.value, getting the access token off of that state, and then just doing an AJAX call with that access token. If you look at this one over here, it's a little bit different. We're listening to the state for changes. When the state has updated, then what we're going to do is we're going to get that access token, check if it's changed from the last time we got it, and then make this data call. You probably wouldn't do it like this in your real app, but I wanted to show you side by side so you could see the difference. And so I had to use the same data call for both of them. And also notice here this take until. This is really important because you can use that to cancel your action. So let's say you're listening to state for changes, but then another permission with that same permission type that you're listening to comes in. Well, then you want to kill this one off and then listen to another one. So not in all cases you need to actually manage your observables like this, but sometimes you might want to write an observable that does more. It's more generic. It can do a lot of things. Like for instance, this one can take multiple fetch permission calls with different permission types and figure out which one is firing and which one's done and which one's going. It can do all that with this little bit of code, and then this take until is like the awesome part of it, because it will take it until another action fires with that exact same permission type and that exact same action, which is fetch permission. So that's another way you can like kill this off so that you don't have two listeners listening for the same thing. Okay, so here's another example of a cancel. So in this case, it's the same call as before, we're fetching inventory items, but what we're going to do is we're going to listen for state. So we're going to keep fetching the inventory items as long as our state changes and we get a new access token. Yeah, go ahead.
What's the switch map?
Switch map? Yeah, switch map switches you to a new observable. So if you've heard of map, map can change your data into another set of data. So you can change from an object to an array, or an object to an object with different properties. A switch map here switches your observable pipeline here. Currently we're listening to action. Now we're going to be listening to state. That's what this does. Yeah, and then as you pipe down through it, we're getting the access token out of it. We're going to filter to see if we even have an access token. If we don't want it. And then so let's say like it does filter. Let's say we don't have an access token at the point you try to make this call. So some things we could do is like display modal and be like, hey, you got an error. This is not working right. You're not authenticated. In this particular example, what we're going to do is we're just gonna say, no, I'm done. I'm done. So filter Boolean here. Boolean is a function in JavaScript that converts anything you give into it into a truthy or falsy value. So you guys are probably familiar with that because JavaScript does this automatically. But in this case, we can actually use it like a function, pass it into the filter function, and then it will call Boolean anytime a value comes through. And if that value is true, it goes down through the chain. If it's false, it stops right there. So what's important here is that if it's false, we still sitting here listening for state changes. We're still listening to see if you do get an access token. So if the state changes and a new access token comes in, then we'll pass this filter here. It'll take one, which means just take one thing, like let one thing down through the pipeline and then kill the observable off once you're done. So in this case, we're going to take one, which means only take this one, so we're not going to make this data call a second time, now that we have an access token, and then go ahead and make your data call. Okay, so here we've got this thing that's a block list updater. This is more typical of what you've seen. This is actually production code right now. And so this is a thing that listens for a block list to come down, and it listens every hour. Now, one thing about set interval that you guys have probably dealt with is that set interval doesn't get called immediately. It gets called after that time that you put into it. Same as set timeout. So what you got to do to make this trigger immediately is to do a start with. So at the very beginning of my observable chain here, I have my interval, which says fire off after 1 hour. So every hour, this will just emit some value. Now, I want it to go immediately, right when you start the app as well. So I have to start with 0. The 0 can be anything, it can be null, it can be whatever you want. But I just put a 0 there because interval gives you a number, like an increasing number every time it fires off. So I just use the same data type. And then when I start, make an AJAX call, go get that domain, go to that domain, go get that information, and then just go through this chain here. So that's important because at the same time, I'm also pulling that data from local storage as a cache. And so I want to make sure that I keep only my AJAX value if it came first before the cache, right? Well, this example does not do that. So it pulls this out of local storage. I know the syntax looks a little bit messy here. This is because Chrome didn't update and I had to change it. So if you look here, this is at the very end, I'm calling an action here, update block list. This is an action. It just returns you back an object with a type property on it. You guys are probably familiar with how Redux works, so that's how this is handled. But what's important here is I've got this, and what could happen potentially in my application right now is that the AJAX can come back first, and the local storage would then be the one from cache will override that because that action could happen potentially second. Now I'm going to say that it will happen second because we're having some problem with the drive. There's like a hard drive or something, and it's on some old interface, and that's why it's causing this problem. So the way we would fix that, if you looked at the example before, is we're going to put a take until. So we're basically going to keep the code exactly the same, but all I added was this take until, and I say take it until this action is fired, this block list updated. That's the exact action that will fire off from the AJAX side as well. When your block list gets updated, it will fire this action. So I just sit here listening for it, and I say, if this action is fired, don't worry about the block list anymore. We're done. We don't care about it because if it does call update block list, then we'll get that bad response. So that's like a quick way you could fix some issue like that you're having. So this is an example of unit testing observables, specifically Redux-Observable observables. It's a little bit complicated to look at, but this is all we're mocking here. So I had to mock the AJAX piece of it, which is nice actually because you can do it. And I can just say, I want AJAX to return me an observable. Of means return just whatever value through the pipeline. It's one of the most basic observables that you can deal with. And basically I just want to say, I got a response of 500. So when AJAX gets called in your observable chain, it will just return this value, response 500. And this fetch user is like your action, so I'm going to put this login form thing, say, oh, the user didn't enter in for information, this is going to happen. Don't worry about this piece, this is state related, I don't want to go into that. But basically our state is just an object at this point, and this is what we'll get back. So when I go down here, I just subscribe to it, I make sure it should be equal, my bad. So it should be deep equal to fetch user failed. And you'll know that because this is what that action should return. So if you look down here, we've got the same thing. The user entered in some information. This is what should come back. So we're calling that action. We're jerry-rigging our AJAX call so that it returns a response that looks like this. And when it comes out of the observable chain, it will fire off this action, fetch user fulfilled. We can check to make sure that that's what we got. So that's another way to do that. And here's another example where you might be doing file uploads. So I've done this before multiple times now, where I've got to upload files, but I want to upload the files in pairs of 2 because I want to have the bandwidth saturated, but I don't want to have it so saturated that they upload like slower for some reason. So I want to upload the files in pairs of 2, and then I also want to make sure that what's happening to the files is I know every time a file has been updated, I know which file's been uploaded, and then I also know when the whole thing's done. So this code, this very simple piece of code here, is able to do that. It looks a little complicated, but I'm also adding an artificial delay. What I could be doing here is like an AJAX call or a SFTP like upload call from Node, and I could be doing a lot of stuff. So basically, this is an observable that outputs 1, 2, 3, 4. That's all it does in order immediately. It's a good. And then so what I'm doing here is I'm mapping that value to a delay. and I'm multiplying 1,000 by that delay, so every single one's like a second later. So the first value comes in, it takes 1 second, the second value takes 2 seconds to come through, and it sits on this delay until that delay's up, and then it goes to the map piece. So delay is like a set timeout. But look how clean this is. Look how easy this is. It goes from top to bottom. There's no like, here's a set timeout, and it calls this function. This function's located up here, and then you got to find that thing and go over here, and then you got to go over here to find this other piece. So this is what the benefit is, and why it's so powerful, is you can have something that I can read top to bottom, I can skim it, I can figure out what's going on, and then I can see my output, which ends up looking like this. So I'm calling this action finished uploading. It gives me a value. At the very end, there's no value that's passed in. See, there's no value here, and then I just send back all. That's the default in this case. So this is not production code. This is just something that I came up with, which is a simple example of something I've used in production. But if you look here, these times are not 1, 2, 3, 4, and the reason they're not 1, 2, 3, 4 is because I'm doing them in pairs of 2. So it waits for it has like 2 slots that are available for downloading or uploading, and one's being used by the 1 second, one's being used by a 2 second one, and then when that 1 second one's gone, another comes in, number 3. And then, so it's 3 plus 1, and that's why you get 4. I know that's probably a little complicated here, but basically this merge all says bring it down to just 2 at a time. So it does all this work for you. You don't have to like write it in, you don't have to calculate it, you don't have to create your own framework for it. You just type in literally one operator, and it will delay your observables to execute only in pairs until they're done. And then this concat here basically says at the very end, once you're done with everything, go ahead and fire off that action. And then the last thing I wanted to show you here was debugging. So let's say I had an issue, and I was like, why is this not working? Something's wrong here, right? I can quickly do something like this and debug from that point in the app. It's very quick and easy. I can also, I can get like the value, right? And I can, I can go here, and if I wanted to, I can write debugger, but some of your linters might kill that, right? So you could just do a console log here, and then put a debug in your in Chrome. Like if you're debugging this in Chrome, you can put a little debug marker there too as well. So debugging is very easy, and I do have a catch error example, and I don't remember which one it is because I can't see it. Oh, here it is. So here's an example of like what you would do if you catch an error. So we're making an AJAX call, right? We are plucking the response off it. We're storing those permissions. But what if something happens? In this case, the AJAX could fail. The response could come back malformed. When I'm storing the permissions, that action has some error or something. Well, okay, no big deal. We'll catch the error, and we're going to open a modal. And in this case, the reason that would happen, I'm just like making a blanket statement, is that you don't have permission to access permissions. So this open modal is just a Redux action. That's all it is. There's nothing special about it. It doesn't actually open the modal. It just fires a Redux action that some part of your app is listening to for state changes, and it'll get an action that says, hey, you don't have permission to do this, and it'll load up that modal, and you can see what's going on. So this is a very easy way of handling errors. In fact, if I wanted to, I could stop it right here. I could be like, fire off an observable that doesn't do anything. So there are ways to eat errors. I could console log at the same time. I can do bunches of things in this function. But what's beneficial here is it's just like a catch and a promise, but I can potentially stop it at this point. I don't have to keep going. Or if I want to, I can keep going, or I can fire off another action like this to say, hey, there's an error, and display a red bar at the top of the screen and say, hey, there's an error there. So that's how you can use that. Now, Redux-Observable. How easy would this be for your team to integrate? Kind of depends on your team. But from the experience I've had, it's very easy to get started and get working with it. It takes a little bit to understand the difference between a few of the operators, but once you're using it for like maybe a week or two, it doesn't take very long to really start getting going with it. Also, it's reduce your overall complexity of your application because you're not having to worry about indirection. You don't have to worry about going up here and then coming up here and then doing this. You just go straight down from top to bottom, and because the actions, because of the Redux actions, it's very modularized. So you say, if you want to do something, instead of calling the function from somewhere else in your app, you just call an action. And you don't really call the action, you just let it go through your pipeline. And then that action happens at the end, it gets fired off. When that happens, that really slims down your application because you can start developing these little modules that only need to worry about the action piece. You don't have to worry about, oh, I'm calling this function, I'm doing this. So let's say like you want to refactor something, right? You want to change the properties of it. You can leave the old action there. You don't have to change it. Just put a new action and then modify the props and then go ahead with it. Or like an API, you can just add more props to it on the object. You just say, okay, I'm going to get more things into this action. So some things might not be sending it, some things might, but you can account for that in your observable. it doesn't require your app even have Redux. So this is something that's very interesting that I used in the Chrome plugin. I used Redux-Observable stateless. That's why I rewrote it there in that example, because I don't even have any state. In fact, Redux-Observable is doing everything. It's just putting stuff in local storage, bringing stuff out of local storage, getting the AJAX call, popping that into the Chrome plugin in their specific functions. I don't have to store that information anywhere. And that's what's very interesting about all of this, is that you don't have to have state. You don't even need it. So Redux-Observable gives you an even like greater power than Redux, but with the same mindset, the same action thing happening. So if you don't like reducers, you don't have to use reducers. Now, I'm not saying to do that. I have almost always had state, but in this particular instance, I didn't want to bring in Redux. I didn't want to add more maintenance to the application. I don't want bigger things, so I wrote this like 30-line file where anybody can just swap it out with a real Redux-Observable, and then you can have Redux-Observable. And it was very simple. So that's my talk today, and hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you show an example of, I know your examples weren't using Redux, but how would you use it with Redux? Like if you have a store, is that like, are you configuring it as middleware, or how does that work?
So I don't have any on hand, but yeah. So when you're putting Redux-Observable into Redux, there's a middleware piece that Redux takes when you're initializing it, and you add. There's a way to do it. You have to call some function that says create root epic or something like that, and then you pass in those pieces, and you just put that in your middleware, and it'll just run. So what's interesting about Redux-Observable is that it runs after the reducers. I think Thunk runs before, and Saugus does, but Redux-Observable runs after, because if your state has changed, you might want to react to that. You might want to say, you know, after this action gets called, I actually want to see the state after the action was called, not before. So Redux-Observable, unlike some other middlewares, actually runs after the reducers have all run in updated state. So.
And then I have a follow-up question.
Yeah,
so,
go ahead.
From your views, are you still just like dispatching the action objects, or are you dispatching epics, or how does that
No, you just dispatch actions.
Okay.
So it's just Redux actions, and the epics are listening for actions that come through.
Gotcha.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the parts that makes Redux useful to develop with is often just like the ability to kind of step back through history. Does Redux-Observable or RxJS give you any type of way to examine like the flow of data through the pipe, or is it just using tap to kind of debug it when you run into a problem?
Yeah, so you can. So you're saying you want to be able to see what the data looks like through every step of the transitions?
Yeah, if there's a history or some sort of like way to visualize that.
Yeah, that would be really hard. I'm trying to think of it in my head right now, like how you might do it. You know, Rx might have something. RxJS itself might have something like that you can hook into. But I would say, yeah, like I just tap into the stream whenever I need it, and I think that's just the thing of like how streams work, because really that pipeline that looks nice and you know, tab to the left, what that really is all those functions just wrapping each other like an onion.
Okay.
And so yeah, it's a little bit different than that.
Which you would still be able to use Redux and the dev tools to see all of the state changes and the actions.
Yeah.
There, you just
Yeah.
wouldn't see the pipeline of the.
Just have smaller observables too. You can that way you can really see what's going on. Anybody else?
So I've never done anything with this, but I have used sagas, and so with the sagas, there's like the stuff that you start at the beginning and like always running, always watching, reacting to things. But then I would have sagas that were like launched with a screen. Like a screen comes up and it starts a screen-specific saga that's watching for things on that screen. When that screen closes, that saga shuts down. It's not watching. It's not taking up any resources or whatever, because it's launched specifically for that. How does that work with?
So the way I've used it in React is I will have an element that will appear when a route loads. And when that loads, like for instance, it could fetch data, it could start a WebSocket connection, and I have a component will unmount. I will have an action that gets fired that says like, hey, kill off that connection. So it will completely be controlled by the component if it's anything to do with the view.
So is it just like shutting down an epic so that epic's not like watching?
That epic can shut itself down.
Okay.
So it can do that take until, like we saw before, and when that action happens, that unsubscribe action or that stop listening action, it'll just kill itself off.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then it would start back up once that.
Once that action comes through the pipeline again, it'll create a whole new one, and start listening. Yep.
So thanks everyone for coming. Next time, I think we'll be talking about GraphQL, yeah?
Yeah, if we don't have any other speakers, I'll be
Okay,
on that.
And, or there's a JavaScript KC Slack channel, if you don't know about that. Google JavaScript KC Slack, and we're on there. Okay, do it all the same time. So, thanks a lot.